Welcome to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre Marie coming to you from St. Benedict Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. Our websites are Catholicism.org and Reconquest.net. My email address is bam, at Catholicism.org. I can also be found easily on Twitter at Brother_Andre and on Facebook. Our topic this evening is On the Church Militant. I'll explain that a little bit. My guest is Mr. Ryan Grant, the managing editor of Mediatrix Press, a professional Latinist and a scholar who's translated numerous works of Saint Robert Bellarmine into English, including the book entitled On the Church Militant. Before we get to Ryan and start digging into the book that he so laboriously translated from Latin, I thought I'd give a couple of introductory comments about Saint Robert Bellarmine, a couple of reminders. But first, I want to do a couple of very quick commercials. Please consider coming to the St. Benedict Center Conference this fall. The dates are September 30th and October 1st. It's a Friday, Saturday. And details can be found out on Catholicism.org, our website. Just go there and search for 2016 conference, and you'll see a write-up of it. Mike Church, founder of the Veritas Radio Network, is going to be a speaker at the conference, as will Gary Potter, Joe Doyle, and some other speakers are being lined up now. It'll be a 2-day event, and it promises to be very informative, and it will also provide good Catholic friendship and fellowship. And there'll be wine, too, so it often helps the discussions. And also, please consider signing up for the Ad Rem mailing list. It's an email list that I maintain. You can sign up for it on Catholicism.org. And also, you can consider going to Reconquest.net and sign up to get automatic notifications every time I put up a new posting on that site, which is once a week or twice a week max. It'll tell you about the details of the next show, just in case you want to keep informed so that you know to listen. Now, we're going to talk about St. Robert Bellarmine and his great work on the Church Militant, which my guest, Ryan Grant, has translated. St. Robert Bellarmine, again, quick review. He was born October 4th, 1542 in Montepulciano, Tuscany, Italy. And he died September 17th in 1621 in Rome. He's a major figure of the Catholic Reformation, or also the Counter-Reformation. 2 different names for the same thing under 2 different formalities. St. Robert Bellarmine was canonized by Pope Pius XI only in 1930, which is very late, and there are reasons for that because he was so controversial to certain people. He was declared a doctor of the Universal Church the next year in 1931, and he is the patron saint of catechists. So joining me now via Skype is Ryan Grant. Good evening, Ryan. How are you?
Good evening, brother. I'm well, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for joining us. So why don't we just sort of dig into the book here, and is there anything that you'd like to say about it just by way of introduction, general introduction to the book, before we go to page 1?
Right. Certainly. The work, it's in the next section, so some listeners might be familiar with my work on Saint Robert Bellarmine on the Roman Pontiff, which is a very massive book. And if you have the one volume, it's about 650 pages. The next treatise that follows that is on the Church. And there are 2 books that precede this one. One is on councils, the other is on the authority of councils. And then there's this work, the Church Militant, and then the next one is on the marks of the Church, where in Latin it's on the notes of the Church, the Notae Ecclesiarum, and Notae Ecclesiae, and that's the things by which the Church is known. That's been I translated that about a year or more ago, and that's available from my website or on Amazon. So the purpose of this work, so this kind of becomes like a blueprint work, where, he started off in the controversy. The very first controversy is on Christology, on Christ. The next one is on sacred scripture, then on the Roman Pontiff. And now we're proceeding down kind of into the Church. So you got Christ, the head of everything. And then you have scripture, right, the primary revelation that's been given about him and why it's not a judge of controversies. So then who is the judge of controversies? The Roman Pontiff. And what body was constituted under the Roman Pontiff, and that's the Universal Church. So that's why, so this sets up the discussion then to move to another work, which I may have out later in the year. It might be early next year, which is on specifically on the members of the Church Militant, where he deals with monks, clergy, and laity. The section on laity, De Laicis, actually is in translation from, I think, the Liberty Fund. It's also very readable, very good translation.
Okay, so by the way, your website, you mentioned your website where people can get this book. It's mediatrixpress.com, right, Ryan?
Right, that's correct.
So all of these books that you've translated from Saint Robert Bellarmine are available at that site.
They're there. If you click on the Bellarmine translation tab, it's there. There's a page on the Roman Pontiff where you get everything that's just on that work. And then, of course, the All Titles A to Z, I have those divided. All Titles A to Z paperback, hardcover, and ebook. And so everything is listed there, although I do have to update the ebooks. There's some that I haven't updated to reflect. But anyway, so in the All Titles paperback, you'll find all my translations. They're not all in hardback because they have to be a certain size for my publisher or my printer to handle the hardbacks. And then I'm actually looking for someone that can do print on demand for hardbacks. That way I don't have to cough up, $5,000 to get a bunch of books all up front. So anyway. But you can get all of those on the website, including this book on the Church Militant, and it's also available on Kindle.
Oh, okay. So they can, then they can purchase even the real book. They can purchase on Amazon if they're so inclined, right?
That's right. In fact, if you go to Amazon and you type in Mediatrix Press, you will get all of my books, plus a handful of other listings that have Mediatrix somewhere in the title that aren't mine.
Okay.
But anyway, there's like some $80 books, some prof on women in the Middle Ages, I think. I'm not sure what it is. I'm not sure what the book's about, but all I know is I didn't write it.
Okay. All right. So we're talking about the term church. That's where Saint Robert Bellarmine starts this volume. So church, in Latin, it's the ecclesia, and it's the same thing in Greek, right? From ekaleo, the verb for to call.
That's how Bellarmine identifies, and that's how traditionally it's treated on by theologians. So the Greek name is ekaleo, and it's a verb. It means I call out, and then ekklesia is a participle out of that, so it means called out. So oftentimes in the Old Testament, especially in modern Bibles, it's translated as the assembly. And in theology of this period in which Bellarmine's writing, it's traditional to actually call the Old Testament assembly the church. So it's the church that's still hidden, more or less, and whereas the New Testament church is the church revealed. Mm-hmm. More or less, using St. Augustine's phrase, the Old Testament is the new concealed, the new is the old revealed. Okay. So the church is the body of those that are called out by God. So that's the Greek term that's used. Now, Bellarmine also gives here in this book on page 4 the Hebrew. And by the way, I don't know Hebrew. I had to go to someone who's advanced in Hebrew to track all the words down and render them for me so that I could print them. But so the Hebrew word is also the root for synagogue as well as church. So it's the Hebrew edah, which means congregation. And the Septuagint translates that into synagogue. And that's said to be ya'ad, to gather, right? That's the root verb for edah, congregation, is ya'ad. And then you have ka'al, which is also translated as the church, but it comes from ka'aleh, which is to gather. There's like a subtle difference between those two. They're spelled exactly the same. At least, again, that's how it was explained to me. I just had to put it at the front there. I don't actually know Hebrew myself.
Okay, so there's and he distinguishes that the word for the church in the New Testament actually shows its superiority to this congregation of the Old Testament, right? That's right. And the two names basically mean the same thing, but it's what they are that are there to do. And throughout the book, the difference between the two, when answering different objections, the difference between the church in the Old Testament and the New is delved into very heavily because of the fact that oftentimes, even though the Protestants somewhat maintain the principle of suppressionism, that is, that the Old Testament was fulfilled in the New and therefore ceases to exist as its own body anymore. It exists now as the church. So even though Protestants loosely held to that idea, at the same time, there is a tendency to equate
the Old and the New Testament as if they were on the same ground. So examples in the Old Testament will then become the absolute, proof to trump how, say, the New Testament is interpreted for the Protestants. And that's one of the reasons why, Bellarmine will keep making the distinction between the Old Testament church, the synagogue, or prior to that, the temple, and the New Testament church, which is, he'll give the definition in the next chapter.
Mm-hmm. And he says to be gathered in common is common. To be gathered is common among both men and beasts, but to be called out is proper to men. So to be called out is something superior. So that shows the superiority of the church over the synagogue, right?
That's right. I mean, there's a certain sense in which the synagogue is called out too. It's called out from amongst the nations awash in idolatry that don't know the true God, and that are going this way and that. But this is the body that God has called out to Himself. So He's called out from this mass of men. Now, the New Testament is the body that's been called out to be with God as adopted sons in Christ, which is something, so we're all adopted. That's something that the Jews never had, even no matter how good they could be, until the time in which Christ would come. And then those who were justified in the Old Testament were then saved at the coming of Christ. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Or sorry, at the rising of Christ, sorry.
Yeah, at the ascension. So then we move on from the definition of church, or rather from the meaning of the word, the etymology of it, and its literal meaning etymologically, to what the definition is of the church. And there would have been a lot of false definitions of the church floating around in these days. So Saint Robert Bellarmine is very careful to give a tripartite definition of the church that encompasses every aspect of Catholicity. So how does that definition go?
To boil it down, it's in chapter 2. He basically lays it out that the church is the body of men who are united by the same profession of faith, as well as the communion of the sacraments united to their head. So he says directly, the Catholic teaching is that the church is only one, not two, in that the body of men of the same Christian profession and of the same sacraments gathered in communion in one is one and true, under the rule of legitimate pastors, and especially of the one vicar of Christ on earth, the Roman pontiff. From such a definition, it can be clearly understood what men pertain to the church and which ones do not. For there are three parts of this definition: the profession of the true faith, and then the communion of the sacraments, and lastly, subjection to the legitimate pastor, the Roman pontiff. By the reasoning of the first, all unbelievers, all infidels, and those who have never entered the church are excluded, such as Jews, Turks, and pagans. Then, those who were in the church but left, such as heretics and apostates. By reasoning of the second part, all catechumens and excommunicants are excluded, because they have not been admitted to the communion of the sacraments. These are sent out. By reasoning of the third, all schismatics are excluded, that is, those who have the faith and the sacraments, but are not under the legitimate pastor, and therefore profess the faith and receive the sacraments outside of the church. Still, all others, even the base, wicked, and impious, are included. And that's what a good portion of the rest of the book deals with, of course, is he spends a lot of time on this question that the wicked are members of the church, as long as exteriorly they persist in the profession of faith and the communion of the sacraments, and are at least visibly united to their head. So it serves as a sort of blueprint to determine, who makes up the church. That way, well, this is a heretical sect we shouldn't have anything to do with, because they're outside the church, because they're not under the one head, or this one doesn't have the sacraments, and they have some profession of faith, but it's not our profession of faith, so they're heretics, right? And so on all those three counts, if you don't have all three, you can't be a member of the church.
And when he says Turks, obviously he's not talking about a nationality.
Right.
He's talking about Muslims.
Right. Turk, in Bellarmine's time, the word Turk, ever since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the word Turk becomes synonymous with what used to be Saracen. And Saracen was the word Saraceni in Latin. That was the word for Muslim. And then you sometimes you see Musulmani, and sometimes you see Islamismi, and sometimes you see those, but there's very rare, only rare times. Like there's certain, like the Jesuit Senieri took a lot of time preaching to Muslims, and he learned Arabic, and he actually wrote a whole treatise quoting the Quran in Arabic, then provided a Latin translation, and then a critique and refutation of the Quran in Latin. And you can find that in Google Books if your Latin's good enough to read works of this sort. And so he'll actually use Musulmani,
which is closer to the Arabic, Muslimin. They call themselves Muslimin.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So we know so this, as you point out, he gives a definition, and it's basically three parts. Just to summarize it very quickly, is the assembly of those who share the same profession of the same faith, and the word profession is very important. The profession of the same faith.
So at very least publicly, they profess to have the same faith. So that profession can encompass both secret heretics, those who inwardly reject the faith, but publicly, for whatever reason of social status, or because they don't want to make that jump yet, or they fear some positive law, like in a traditional medieval society where he could be put before church authorities. So you're not going to say it, but inwardly you believe it, right? So that's where you're still visibly anyway in the church, although without the virtue of faith. Later on, Bellarmine will talk about this. You're like a dead member. You're like if you take the analogy of the body, you're like the hair, the nails, and things of this sort that are in the body, but they're not actually living. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, that's a dead member, but they're still visibly a member. So that it also, there's another distinction we'll talk about in a little bit: the soul of the church versus the body of the church. And the soul of the church will refer basically to the predestined. When we get down to it, that is, God foreknows that these men will be saved. And actually, we'll talk a little bit about Catholic predestination. He goes into it a little bit in this book, but not very much. He has a whole book on it. It's the third volume of the Controversies on Grace, Free Will, Predestination, and also on indulgences. Got tacked on there. Indulgences were originally part of the penance tract and sacraments, but he couldn't get it to the printers in time, and that sacraments book is already big enough. So it ended up being its own work, and then got attached to the third volume. So just if anyone's wondering about that.
So he tackles the question of predestination, but not in this book.
He does it in just a little bit, not so much as to refute the Protestant teaching, but simply to identify what the Catholic teaching is for the purposes of knowing how it relates to ecclesiology.
So we're coming up on a break, Ryan, but just to reiterate on that definition of the church, the three parts would include profession of the same faith, the unity of the same governments, being subject to the authority of the church, the bishops, and principally the Pope, they're the head of all the bishops, and then lastly, the communion of the same sacraments. Right?
That's right.
Okay. You're listening to...
Those are the three.
Okay, you're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network, radio the way it should be.
You're listening to Reconquest with Brother Andre Marie, seeking that which was lost and fighting for it. Exclusively on the Veritas Radio Network's Crusade.
Welcome back to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre Marie coming to you from St. Benedict Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. Our websites are catholicism.org and reconquest.net. With me is Mr. Ryan Grant, the publisher of Mediatrix Press, the managing editor of Mediatrix Press, who has translated many of the works of Saint Robert Bellarmine. And he and I are discussing Saint Robert Bellarmine's work on the church Militant, which is part of Saint Robert Bellarmine's On the Controversies. So you said, Ryan, when we were talking off the air there about the five different false definitions of the church that Saint Robert Bellarmine wants to refute as part of giving a true definition. What are those five false definitions?
He gives the first one is prior to his time is that of John Wycliffe and John Hus, and these are related to him by the Council of Constance. And so just assistance for the listener who might not be aware, John Wycliffe or Wycliffe, depending on how you pronounce it, he was a priest in the Middle Ages around the 1300s, and prior to him, England had never had a serious problem with heresy. So Wycliffe was very anti-clerical. He didn't like – I mean, there was some corruption, but it wasn't nearly as bad as it would get within about 150 years. And his big thing was that he'd gotten passed over for various ecclesiastical benefices that he thought he should have had. And so he just set upon the process of reform by getting rid of clerics. So he formed the idea that, that there is no real authority in the church, no residual authority in the church. It's simply if these guys are good, then, hey, then they have authority. But if they're not, they don't. And he set upon translating the Bible out of Latin and into the vernacular and whatnot, which at the time other people were talking about. And it might very well have happened if it weren't for Wycliffe, because he made a distaste in England for any concept of a vernacular Bible, so much to the point that all the way until Henry VIII, even during his marriage, at the beginning of his marriage with Anne Boleyn, it was still forbidden in England to translate the Bible into vernacular, whereas every other country had one.
So Wycliffe was the founder of the Lollard sect, right? The Lollards are...
He was, and
he's kind of a proto-Protestant, right?
In many ways, in fact, Bellarmine calls Wycliffe the father of Luther. So and you see many of his ideas can be found in Luther and Calvin. So, and then also John Hus, who was a revolutionary in Bohemia, that is the modern-day Czech Republic. And, we could talk about Hussitism, but that'll take us quite a while. But anyway, so they were both condemned at the Council of Constance. And their position was essentially a man foreknown, although he might be in grace for a time according to the present justice, is still never part of the church, whereas a man predestined will always remain a member of the church, although at some time he may fall from the grace that he has attained thus far, still not from the grace of predestination. Okay, so you set up this false dichotomy between somebody living well now and somebody who ultimately is going to be in heaven, and God has predetermined that. So he has some special grace. It's essentially once saved, always saved, with slightly different language. And
not only that, but once saved, always saved, and that those are the people exclusively who are in the church.
Right. So anyone who's in the saved, the once saved, always saved, they're in the church, even though they might live horrible lives right now. They're still in the church, and anybody who's, even if they live very good lives, if they haven't been predestined, then they're not in the church.
Okay.
So then we come to the second opinion that he gives, and this is that the church is the multitude of perfect men who don't have any sin. And so Augustine relates that the Pelagians taught this, or some of the Pelagians taught this, when he says they progress in it so that they would say the life of the just in this age is altogether without any sin, and the Church of Christ is perfected by these in this mortal life. Calvin attributes the same teaching to the Anabaptists of this time, that is, of 1588. So then the third position is that the church might be a congregation of the just, or better still, those who have never failed to make the confession of faith. This is distinguished from the second opinion in that it excluded each and every sinner, but this does not exclude anyone except notable sinners. So formally, St. Cyprian thought Novatian was the author of this opinion, and Augustine claimed the Donatists, and Bellarmine adds, "For I believe Calvin and others were deceived who thought that the followers of Novatian and the Donatists excluded every kind of sinner. Cyprian and Epiphanes clearly say that they retained swindlers, adulterers, and the like in the church, but only excluded those who had lapsed under persecution." So the second opinion, as we read, was anyone who was a sinner, basically, was not in the church, but only the perfect were in the church. And this opinion is that those who fail in the profession of faith, those who, when the Roman authorities came and said, "All right, worship Jupiter," and they said, "Well, okay, just please let me go back and whatever, as long as you worship Jupiter here, go ahead." And then those are the ones that they said could not be in the church. Anyone who lapsed in the profession of faith.
And these are the lapsi. These are the ones that were such a huge issue for those particular heretics, the Novatians, who denied the authority of the church to forgive sins. And the the Donatists who denied the validity of priests and bishops who had sinned, right?
Right, to the point where the Donatists said that they alone were the true church and nobody else was.
And they were the only ones that had succession, because sacraments depend for their validity on the probity and faith of the minister.
Right, that was a particular heresy that the Donatists had. So as a result, they alone could have sacraments, they alone could have priesthood and bishops, so they alone, therefore, could be the church.
So both of these early heretics, in a time when this was a real issue, where the Roman, as persecutions came and went, those who lapsed, and there was enormous controversy over how to handle the lapsed. Once, if they wanted to come back to the church, the Novatians said that you couldn't receive them back into the church. Basically, they were toast, right? they might be converted on their deathbed, but
even though Novatian's secretary, I forget his name, I can't remember if it's Cyprian who related this, but Novatian's secretary, when he became an anti-pope and he claimed to be the true pope and whatnot, his secretary was a priest who had forged a certificate showing that various people had pitched their incense to the emperors or to the Roman gods, so which Novatian considered in the same class of those who lapsed in the profession of faith, because he was facilitating, giving the appearance that people had lapsed. But yet his secretary was one of the main forgers of these documents. They're called illibatici, which were documents that showed you were inviolate. That's where it comes from. And so it showed that you had made your offering to the gods, and Romans gave you a certificate. You're a good patriotic Roman that worships the gods, and so on and so forth.
So not every heretics aren't always consistent.
No, as we have seen, and no doubt will continue to see.
Okay, so then we have these are the first two false definitions that Saint Robert Bellarmine
First three
gives.
false definitions, right? So the first one is the predestined and once saved always saved, essentially. The second one is that only the perfect are in the church, and anyone who sins can't really be in the church. The third one is anyone, as long as you've never given up the profession of faith, as long as you've never succumbed to persecution. Now he comes to the fourth one, and he says this is of the confessionists, that is certain Protestants in his time, 1588, who, although they condemn the Pelagians, Novatianists, and Donatists by name, still their opinion is a composite of all those heresies. For, number one, not only the confessionists, but all Lutherans and Calvinists teach that there is no sin that is venial by nature. Rather, all are in and of themselves mortal, but venial by the mercy of God, who does not impute these to believers. Luther teaches this, as well as Philip Melanchthon and Calvin. Then he adds on, the Augsburg Confession in Article 7 teaches that the church is the congregation of the saints who truly believe and obey God. And Melanchthon, in his defense of it, tries to show that sinners do not pertain to the church except in name. John of Brent's teaches similar things in the Prolegomena against Pedro de Soto, who's a theologian from Spain.
He was a good guy.
He was a good guy. Well, of course, if John of Brent's a Lutheran's writing against him, that's a positive. But it's neither is it opposed to this that Melanchthon and Brent's both say that the wicked are mixed up with the good, for they in effect create two churches, one that's true, to which the privileges related in the scriptures pertain. This is the congregation of the saints who truly believe and obey God. And this one is not visible, but can be seen with the eyes of faith. The other is external, which is a church in name only. And this is the congregation of men coming together in the doctrine of faith and the use of the sacraments. So in this, the good and the bad are discovered. And consequently, they never mean that the wicked are parts of the true church. And so Melanchthon cautiously does not say that the church consists only from the wicked, or not only, but from the wicked as well as the good. Rather, he says the wicked are mixed into the church. So he's trying to avoid the appearance of that. But in effect, so the same thing likewise with Brent, they create two different churches. So we have a church of the pure, that's the church of the saints. And then you have the church of the impure, or the wicked. And that way they're not, you don't admit any wickedness in the church.
Mm-hmm.
So then Bellarmine goes on. Luther, he says, in his work on the councils in the church, in the third part, says that the church is the holy Christian people, That he might show himself to speak on the sanctity of each of the members, he tries to show the Pope and the cardinals are not of the Church because they are not holy. Therefore, if only the just are part of the true Church, and all sins, insofar as they are light, are mortal sins, and make a man unjust, it follows that only the perfect and those lacking all sin are in the Church, which was the very doctrine of the Pelagians. Then number 3, the Confessionists say, and in this they agree with all Lutherans, that all the works of man, even of the justified, are mortal sins. And of course, the Lutherans still teach this today. The Augsburg Confession clearly indicates this, but Luther asserts it more in his assertions, assertiones. His assertions, by the way, that book, it's called The Assertions of the Articles. And what that was is when Pope Leo X condemned various articles of Luther, Luther had a big show where he condemned Exsurge Domine, the bull of Leo X condemning him, and then wrote a book reasserting all of his articles and added a whole bunch more to it. So that's the book that Bellarmine's referencing here. So in his assertions, Luther asserts that it seems to follow that no man is in the Church. For if only the just are in the Church, and there are altogether no just in the world, naturally, when the works of every man are sins, who, I ask, will constitute the Church? But they easily explain the whole matter when they say the works of the just are all mortal sins, but still they are not imputed to them if they have the faith. And hence, he who has faith at the same time is the most just, and also sins in every work. In some manner, the Confessionists agree with the Donatists and the Novatianists, for as they did not exclude all sinners from the Church, but only those who committed idolatry. So the former do not exclude all sinners, but only those who do not truly believe, namely, all those who believe what they say, rather than all Catholics. For they think, as we said, that no crime is imputed to believers. Right, so just to boil down this fourth notion of the Church, so as he notes, it's common to all Protestants in his time, Lutherans and Calvinists and the Swiss Confessionists and others. So what happens is that they say that every sin is a mortal sin, and every act of man is a sin, but God doesn't impute it to him if he has the faith. So
instead we have imputed justice, right? Fiduciary justice.
The justice instead, but not, and Luther goes so far as to say that Christ, not even that was Christ the worst adulterer, and he's not even just speaking this metaphorically, in as much as he takes on all our sins. He says that Christ actually did commit adultery with Mary Magdalene. Luther says that in a couple places, one in his book on the abolition of private Mass, the other on the Babylonian captivity of the Church, right? And I'm not sure if that was some kind of hyperbole to emphasize the imputation of sin or of justice. I have no idea, but one of those nutty things that he would get into. So therefore, justice is imputed. So as long as you have the faith, you get the justice imputed to you. And thus God kind of, as the expression goes, although it's doubtful Luther himself actually said this, I've never seen a direct attribution to Luther, but it still holds correctly for what he's talking about, that man is like a big dung pile covered over with the justice of Christ's snow. But nothing's been changed. So whereas in the Catholic teaching, grace builds upon nature, in the Protestant teaching, grace essentially destroys nature, or even overlooks it and just doesn't even deal with it.
Yeah, because they don't believe in the internal. At least the early Protestants did not believe in the internal renewal that the Council of Trent talks about, where you're actually made interiorly holy. God is just imputing Christ's merits to you externally, forensically, right?
That's right.
You're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. Ryan, I have to take 30 seconds to do a 30-second spot for the Founders Pass. If you like what you're hearing on the Crusade channel today, why not support our crusade and become a Founders Pass member today and gain instant streaming and download access to every episode of this show and all the others on the Crusade channel, including the Mike Church Show and True Money with David Simpson and several others. You can subscribe to the Founders Pass for as little as 23 cents a day. You can also choose between a monthly or yearly membership. And during July, for every yearly membership, we'll ship you an autographed copy of Humility of Heart, signed by this new edition's editor, our very own Mike Church, for free. But that's not all. As a special free gift, we are also offering beautiful handmade wooden kitchen cutting boards from our sponsor, McClureBlock.com, for becoming a founding brother or crusader or if you make a $500 cash donation to our monthly crowdfunding campaign. Please join our crusade today and become a Founders Pass member by going to veritasradionetwork.com/join or call 866-483-3833. Again, that's 866-483-3833. My church said that was 30 seconds. I don't know how I did, but... Okay, Ryan, so now we're back. We're talking about the false definitions of the church. And you've just touched on the Lutheran concept of external imputation of Christ's merits. Where are we?
We're on the fifth opinion now. And so Bellarmine says, this seems to have been raked together from all of these, for it teaches that the church is constituted only from the predestined. And this is, of course, the Calvinist teaching. And I believe some Presbyterians still believe this today. I don't know about all, but and then other groups, the Church of Scotland, for example, they're very liberal, but at least doctrinally, they still profess to believe this. Bellarmine adds, Calvin taught three things in this regard. That is, that the church is only the predestined. Once someone has the faith, he can never be damned. And furthermore, all who have the faith are necessarily predestined. And then he cites where Calvin holds these positions, which you can see in the book. Now, number two, Calvin teaches that the true church can be recognized by God alone, since its foundation is divine election, because it is constituted from the faithful who are necessary from the number of the elect. And then thirdly, he teaches, in addition, a certain external church wherein the good and the bad dwell, such as the Confessionist said above. And he holds in the same book and chapter in the subsequent sections. Martin Bucer seems to think the same thing, and he defines the kingdom of Christ as the charge of salvation of the elect of God, whom God has gathered on earth. And the Calvinist Tilman Hesch teaches the same thing, right? So essentially, to boil that down, the church for Calvin is invisible in all Calvinists. It can't be seen. God knows what the church is, but we cannot, because this is all known to God alone. So on earth, there's no way for one man to know whether another is in the church. And Calvinists always struggle with this, a very hard doctrinaire Calvinist, that am I saved? Am I in the predestined? Because even they don't know, right? They have no way to know for sure. And then they go through a crisis of faith where they either emerge as strict doctrinaire, Calvinists, yes, we know this is the case, and yes, I am predestined, or they fall away altogether.
They have signs by which they know they can be in the true church, right? Including material prosperity. So if you're rich,
that's one, right? So if you're rich, that's supposed to be a good sign. So, for example, Oliver Cromwell, that's what happened to him. He was gentry, but he had a rich uncle, and the rich uncle went bust, and then Cromwell was reduced in his state to basically a tenant farmer almost on his own land. He's farming away and working himself off, and he couldn't make ends meet, couldn't get the money, so he became convinced that he must be damned. But he comes through that, and he has a conversion where suddenly he feels now justified and elect, and things start to turn around for him. So he took that as a sign that he was predestined, and then his fateful course to be involved in the murder of Charles I and then the ravages of Ireland. So nevertheless, that's an example of how that tends to work for them.
Somebody told me there's actually an interestingly good side to this. Somebody told me, actually our mutual friend Charles Colomb told me that in South Africa, a lot of these Afrikaners who were Calvinists, when apartheid was done away with, in the present state of South Africa, a lot of these guys have become disenfranchised. And because of this, they've had to do this sort of internal soul searching that down on your luck Calvinists do. And as a result, there have been some conversions to the Catholic Church. And
there have. That's a really interesting situation. It's just, alas, there's no time to talk about that.
Yeah.
There's a book that did a really interesting analysis of South Africa. It's called Flat, Broke, and the Free Market. And he went to various countries in Latin America. And I don't agree with everything he wrote in the book, but he had a lot of good analysis for why the Milton Friedman Chicago School of Economics didn't work when it was applied in Latin America and Africa and other places.
I see. Well, hopefully these Afrikaners will keep converting. So don't let me distract you from the 5 false definitions. Did we finish the 5th false definition?
Yeah, we did. So just to recap, there's the very first definition, which a little bit like what we just talked about, is that all sins are mortal, but they're not imputed. I'm sorry, I looked at the wrong page. The first error was that the predestined alone were, those who had the grace of predestination were in the church, and they alone could be made up from it. So it's very similar to the 5th. It was the position of Wycliffe. The second, again, was that only the perfect are in the church. The third is those who never failed in the profession of faith. The fourth was the Lutheran issue of sins being imputed, so that not only are all the just in the church, but as anyone who sins cannot be. But of course, everyone who does anything sins is just not imputed to him, and that which in effect creates the two churches. And then finally, the Calvinist position that only the predestined are in the church. So Bellarmine comments on these. The Catholic teaching, so we already went through that, is only one. The church is only one, the visible church that is the visible profession of faith in the communion of the sacraments and under the obedience to legitimate pastors. So he says the difference between our teaching and all others is that all others require external virtues to constitute someone a member of the church, and for that reason they make the church invisible. But even though we believe all the virtues, that is faith, hope, and charity, and the others, are discovered in the church still, that someone could absolutely be called part of the true church on which the scriptures speak, we do not think any internal virtue is required, but only the external profession of faith, as well as the communion of the sacraments, which is taken up in that sense. For the church is a body of men that is just as visible and palpable as the body of the Roman people, or the kingdom of France, or the Republic of Venice. At least in his times, it no longer exists. Either of those two, actually.
Yeah.
So so he adds on for St. Augustine. St. Augustine says that the church is a living body in which there is a soul in a body. And in the soul, there are internal gifts of the Holy Spirit, namely faith, hope, and charity. The body is the external profession of faith, as well as the communication of the communion of the sacraments. From there, it happens that some men are in the soul and body of the church, and furthermore are united to Christ the head, inwardly and outwardly. And such are perfectly in the church, since they are living members in the body, although among them there are also those who participate more or less in the life of the church, and some even who might hold only the beginning of life, like a sense but not emotion, just as those who only have faith without charity. So again, some might be in the soul of the church and not in the body, and this he takes up in the next chapter. So that is the catechumens or the excommunicated, if this is a proviso on the excommunicated, if they might have faith and charity, which can happen. And he'll talk about that. We'll come to that in the excommunicated section. We'll go more in brief for these other chapters. So then some may be in the body, but not in the soul, such as those who have no internal virtue, and still by hope or by some temporal fear profess the faith and communicate in the sacraments under the rule of their pastors. And such are like hairs or nails or bad humors in the body. So to summarize all of that, St. Augustine had to make, when he dealt with the Donatists, made this distinction that's implicit in many of the other fathers, and after him is universal in the explication by theologians, that is that the church is analogous to a human being, has both a body and a soul. So the soul of the church is informed and provided with faith, hope, and charity by the Holy Spirit, whereas the body of the church is as the definition that's just been given, that tripartite definition of those who profess the faith, those who adhere under the obedience of their pastors, and who have the union of the sacraments, right? The communion of the sacraments, I'm sorry. So those things are someone could be considered as part of one and not the other. And that has certain effects that he deals with. So we'll just go through, and that's what determines with the rest of it. So the next chapter deals with the unbaptized. And the first thing he deals with are the catechumens. Now, catechumens, that's a term from the early church, the catechumenate, And actually, I believe, unless I'm mistaken, it means those who are being instructed. And it's basically someone who's receives the faith, who wants to enter the church, but he's not yet received baptism, right? So he professes right faith. And the other thing that, and Bellarmine talks about a little bit, but it's mostly seen in other theologians, especially St. Thomas, because they call this baptismus flamminis, the baptism of flame. So that, because it's based on the fire of charity united to right faith and contrition for sins. So Bellarmine goes through the various opinions here and then holds that, according to the common teaching of all theologians, that these men, those, not all catechumens, mind you, but only those who have right faith and true charity, that they would be in the soul of the church, but not the body, unless they, provided that they were ready to be baptized. So on this basis, Bellarmine says that these men can be saved.
Now, you're talking about people who have the internal renewal of justification, right? They're in the state of sanctifying grace.
So that essentially, like the centurion Cornelius in Acts chapter 8, that because of the love that these people have, that not all, remember, not every catechumen, but those who have right faith, contrition for sins, and in true charity. This is something that God has caused in them. This is not a human charity, for whatever reasons of his own. And if they should die without baptism, essentially, they're in the soul of the church, and so they will be saved, according to Bellarmine. And he also cites St. Ambrose, and this is what he's claiming with the Emperor Valentinian. So that is essentially the matter of what Bellarmine teaches in this chapter. And likewise, that follows for the excommunicated. So that if they adhere to the church by true faith and in the love of God, then they could be in the soul of the church, even if the visible situation hasn't been worked out yet, whether it's a reason of politics, such as some kind of corruption in the church, or somebody's bribed the Pope. If you get like a token Renaissance Pope like Eugene IV or Alexander VI, that your enemy has bribed him to make sure you don't get reconciled to the church, right? Which sometimes stuff like that happened, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. God knows what's what. God knows that you are ready to adhere to the body of the church, but because of this failure in men, then it didn't happen. So then again, likewise, is that you die outside the body, visibly speaking, but internally, through true faith, mind you, in true contrition, real penance. Hard to do, by the way. This is not like this could be just simply reckoned about every man, that they would be in the soul of the church and therefore could be saved. So that's what the essence of Bellarmine's teaching on chapter 3.
All right, Ryan, we need to take a break here, and then we'll come right back after that break. You're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network, radio the way it should be.
Your guide to the reconquest of what modern man has lost. Think of it as a roadmap to truth, with a crucifix as a compass. Reconquest is exclusively on the Veritas Radio Network's Crusade.
Welcome back to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre Marie coming to you from St. Benedict Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. We're in the last segment talking to Ryan Grant about On the Church Militant by Saint Robert Bellarmine. And Ryan, we just talked about the unbaptized and what Saint Robert Bellarmine said about them in relation to the church and salvation. Now, you wanted to wrap up a couple of things in the remaining 3.5 minutes. What is that?
Well, based on the tripartite definition of the church, that he has these other categories of those who either are in or out or in the soul or in the body. So we come to heretics and apostates. Heretics and apostates, he says, are not in the body of the church. And that there's actually interesting in terms of modern discussion, because you have all these people running around, once baptized, you're always Catholic, no matter what. So if you have a clear public manifest, heretic who's left the church, even then they'll say, he's never really left because he's still baptized, because he's got the character on his soul. Well, as Bellarmine shows, the character is, it has its effect is to mediate grace for you to be in union with the body, but it doesn't mean you are necessarily in the body, because otherwise the character, the church would be in hell also, because the character is indelible on the soul. It's imparted at baptism.
And it's also invisible, right? He also pointed out it's invisible.
It's invisible, so that obviously can't make you in the church. And that's the other problem with it. So, and likewise, so heretics and apostates are not in the church. Schismatics may have the right profession of belief, but they are not in communion with the head. So they have the union of the sacraments. They may or may not have right belief. They're not always necessarily the same thing. They tend to be, or at least become so, but they're not in union with the head. The excommunicated is the next section, chapter 6. They're excluded by the head. So they are, by whether it's as a matter of discipline or as for false theology or what have you, or for heresy or whatever the case is, they're not in the church now. So then he talks about the predestined. That's a very wide topic to deal with, but he basically says the predestined refer to those who are in the soul of the church. And in this world, it may be people, the predestined may be in the visible church, or they may not be yet. They will be in the future, and God knows when, but they're not. So the predestination in Catholic theology, essentially, unless you follow Banyas and Garrigou-Lagrange, essentially that means that it's only those that God foreknows.
Foreknows, okay, yeah. So that's like the Molinist idea.
Right. And so, well, not so much the Molinist idea. It's actually fairly common in many theologians. But I know Bellarmine, for example, he rejected a lot of Molinist thought. But in his work on predestination in the third volume of the Controversies, he says more or less that it's who God foreknows. The issue with Molina was that he said they were so free that, the foreknowledge that, if God was giving someone that essentially the will was so free that the grace, I forget, there was some error in the concomitant graces, and Bellarmine cited it right away in Molina, but anyway.
So he even contradicted his fellow Jesuit.
Well, he did, actually, when he wrote his letter to Clement VIII, he showed where Banyas had erred. He couldn't understand how Banyas could still maintain the will was free. And on the other hand, with Molina, he said Molina clearly errs, and he clearly says rash things against St. Augustine. He says there are some other issues that were clearly problematic, and he was very clear in his explication. That's why he was sought after by both sides, and sometimes both the Dominicans and the Jesuits would advance Bellarmine's work to prove their position, which would only confuse everyone. So anyway,
Ryan, we're out of time now, but we'll have to pick up this discussion next time you're a guest on Reconquest.
Certainly, I'd be glad to.
Thanks very much for joining us. You've been listening to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. God bless and Mary keep you.